They said my life wasn't worth more than a set of golf clubs. But they had no idea I was hiding an $80 million secret. I sat in a kitchen soaked in the smell of mildew and loneliness. The ticking wall clock sounded like it was counting down the final days of my life. In front of me were two bills side by side. One was for repairing my battered old truck so I could get around. The other was for my blood pressure and heart medication. I opened my wallet. Only a few crumpled bills remained. I had to choose between being able to move or being able to breathe. My name is Stephen, a father who spent his entire life building a future for his children, only to realize that in their eyes, I had become nothing more than an old debt, an embarrassing secret they wanted hidden away behind the walls of their luxury mansions. Welcome to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Stay with me until the end of this story, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled. Yesterday, I called Melvin. He said he was busy. Linda hung up the second she heard me cough. They were terrified I was going to ask for money. Terrified that my poverty might infect their glamorous lives. I pressed a hand against my chest as the pain tightened. Not because of the illness, because of the betrayal. I stared out the window as memories flooded back. I used to work double shifts so Melvin could have his first set of golf clubs. I skipped meals so Linda could wear the prettiest dress at prom. And now here I was, counting pills, the same way I counted the shattered pieces of my life. This house was too large for a man waiting to die, yet somehow too small to hold the compassion of my children. I grabbed the old newspaper wedged beneath the crooked table leg. My hands trembled. I wasn't afraid of death. I was afraid of disappearing without anyone even noticing. But life always takes unexpected turns. Just when I was ready to give up everything, just when I had accepted that I was a complete failure, the phone rang. An unknown number, a lawyer, a will from a distant cousin named Percy. Percy. The only person I had ever taken the time to truly listen to at a dreary funeral years ago. Turns out kindness is never forgotten. It simply waits for the right moment to bloom. A 2,000-acre ranch and $80 million appeared before me like the wildest dream imaginable. But before I could claim any of it, I had to do one thing. I had to carry out one final test for the people I once called family. I stared at the old phone as if it had suddenly turned into a solid bar of gold. On the other end of the line was the calm, professional voice of Attorney Morrison. He repeated the number one more time. $80 million. My ears rang. My aging heart pounded wildly inside my frail chest. I asked him if he had mistaken me for someone else. But no. Percy had named me directly in a 10-page will. I remembered Percy well. A quiet man the family always treated like an oddball. At his wife's funeral 10 years ago, everyone else spent their time gossiping about designer suits and expensive jewelry. I was the only one who stayed beside Percy. I listened to him talk about the sun-scorched fields of Texas for an entire afternoon. I did not do it for money. I did it because I understood what it felt like to be abandoned. And now that simple act of kindness had brought me an enormous fortune. Attorney Morrison explained that I was not only inheriting cash, I was now the legal owner of a 2,000-acre ranch, an entire kingdom of cattle herds, and open land stretching all the way to the horizon. One moment I was counting blood pressure pills to survive, and the next I had become one of the wealthiest men in the region. The shock quickly gave way to a deep, bitter ache. I looked around my miserable kitchen. The cracks in the walls and the leaking ceiling seemed to mock me. I was rich yet still alone. I had $80 million, yet my own children saw me as nothing more than a cheap burden. Attorney Morrison hesitated before reading the final condition of the will. Percy had left behind one last message. Money is a powerful acid. It can melt away the fake masks people wear. He wanted me to keep the inheritance a secret until the test was complete. I tightened my grip around the phone as a daring idea flashed through my mind. I would not rush to put on an expensive suit. I would remain poor, sick old Stephen in the eyes of my children. I wanted to know if there was still even a tiny piece of humanity left inside Melvin and Linda's hearts, or if they had already let the devil guide them completely. I held Percy's letter tightly in my hands. His handwriting was strong and decisive, just like the man himself. Attorney Morrison had just emailed me a copy. Every sentence struck my mind like a hammer blow. Percy wrote that he had spent decades watching this entire family. He called them a flock of vultures circling the corpses of wealth. They only appeared when they smelled money. They only smiled when they saw numbers. Percy chose me because, according to him, I still possessed something the others had lost long ago: sincerity. He wrote, "Stephen, you were the only person who looked into my eyes instead of staring at the watch on my wrist." But Percy also left behind a chilling warning. Money does not change people. It simply reveals who they truly are. He warned me to be extremely careful. Once this secret came to light, the people closest to me could become the most dangerous. They would not stop until they stripped every last thing from me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I sat silently in the darkness of my living room. The glow from my phone screen illuminated the deep wrinkles on my face. I was holding a power capable of changing everyone's lives around me. But I was also holding a spark that could burn everything to ashes. Percy wanted me to carry out a test of the human heart. A test whose outcome might shatter my heart all over again. I began questioning myself. Did I really want to know the truth? Did I truly have the courage to see my children's real faces when forced to choose between family and money? I took a long, deep breath. I had to do this. Not only because of Percy's will, but because of myself. I needed to know whether I still had a real family left. My trembling fingers moved across the contacts on my phone until Melvin's name appeared on the screen. My eldest son. The child I had once been so proud of. The son I sacrificed my youth for so he could build the successful life he has today. I pressed the call button. A single phone call that would begin a chain of horrifying truths I could never have imagined. The phone rang for a long time before someone finally answered. On the other end, I could hear the noisy atmosphere of an upscale country club. Golf clubs clinked together in the background. Melvin's voice came through impatient and irritated. He asked what could possibly be so important that I had to call at this hour. I forced my voice to sound as weak and shaky as possible. I told him the doctor had just warned me that I was at high risk of suffering a stroke. I needed about $5,000 a month to pay for specialized medication and a caregiver. A terrifying silence followed. I could hear Melvin letting out a long, frustrated sigh through the phone. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask whether I was in pain. The very first thing he did was complain about money. He said business had been difficult lately. He had just paid expensive piano tuition for his son. Then there was all the new hockey equipment and the luxury summer vacation the family had already planned. I reminded him that this was a matter of life and death. I only needed help for a few months to get through this dangerous period. Melvin snapped. He said $5,000 was far too much money. He told me I should consider selling my old house or applying for government assistance. Then he said something that made my heart nearly stop. "That's your problem, Dad. Figure it out yourself." I sat there in stunned silence. "So you would rather buy golf clubs than help your father stay alive?" Melvin never answered the question directly. He simply said he had to get back to an important game with business partners. He could not let personal matters interfere with work. Then the line went dead. The endless beeping afterward felt like a knife carving into my chest. The son I once carried in my arms. The little boy I sacrificed meals and comfort for. The child I gave everything to. Now he considered his father's life worth less than a luxury hobby. I collapsed into my worn-out armchair. Hot tears rolled down my wrinkled cheeks. The test had only just begun, yet I already felt like a defeated man. But I could not stop now. I still had a daughter. Linda had always said she loved me more than anyone else in the world. Would Linda be any different from her brother? Or would my precious little girl also push me into the abyss of disappointment? If you believe kindness is always rewarded, make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss the moment when the ungrateful finally face the consequences of their betrayal. I placed the phone back on the table. My hands were still trembling after Melvin's cruel words. The last bit of hope I had left rested with Linda, my daughter, who always spoke sweetly whenever the holidays came around. I dialed her number. The ringing echoed through the room. At that moment, it sounded more like a warning siren than a phone call. Linda answered. Loud music and cheerful laughter blasted through the speaker behind her. I repeated the same story. I told her about the looming risk of a stroke and the $5,000 I needed each month to stay alive. Linda went silent for a second. But it was not the silence of compassion. Her voice suddenly sharpened as she began interrogating me. She asked if I was being scammed by someone. She said the world was full of con artists targeting elderly people. My throat tightened as I explained that this came directly from my doctor. I truly needed her help. Then Linda started complaining. She said she was already struggling with the expenses of living in a luxury apartment. She had just signed payments for a brand new luxury SUV. Linda insisted she had absolutely no extra money. Please understand, Dad, she said. I have my own life and pressures you wouldn't understand. I mentioned the new SUV. I asked whether she could delay some of her spending to help save her father's life. Linda's tone instantly turned irritated. She said the vehicle was necessary for her work and social image. She could not show up in front of wealthy friends driving an old, embarrassing car. Then she said she had an important appointment and abruptly hung up. The lifeless tone of the disconnected call filled the room. I looked toward the mirror. A frail old man with cloudy eyes stared back at me. 2 children, 2 phone calls, and 2 buckets of ice water thrown straight into my face. They had money for expensive golf clubs. They had money for luxury SUVs. But they did not have a single dollar for the life of the father who raised them. That truth hurt even more than death itself. I felt like an abandoned ruin. I sat alone in the darkness, wondering if there was any reason left to continue this test at all. Then, suddenly, I heard the rumbling sound of an old engine pulling into the yard. Headlights shined through the cracks in the front door. Someone was arriving in the middle of the night. What I did not know was that this meeting would completely change the way I viewed human kindness. An angel was about to appear at the exact moment I had lost all hope, and when you discover who that person is, you will not be able to hold back your tears. The old wooden door groaned as I pulled it open. Beneath the dim streetlight, a battered pickup truck rattled loudly in the driveway. A small figure stepped out, exhausted from lack of sleep, yet his eyes burned with worry. It was Tyler, my grandson. The boy had driven non-stop for 800 miles from his university the moment he overheard part of my phone call with his father. Tyler rushed toward me and wrapped his arms around me tightly. He was trembling with fear for his grandfather's health. He did not ask about money. He asked if I had eaten. He asked how I was feeling. He gently helped me back inside his young and steady hands, supporting my frail body. Then Tyler placed an old, worn envelope onto the table. The corners were frayed from being carried around too long. He told me there was $843 inside. Every single dollar he had managed to save from working part-time at a bakery and washing cars over the past 2 years. Tyler grabbed my hand, his voice shaking with emotion. "Grandpa, don't worry about the medicine anymore," he whispered. "I already decided I'm taking a break from college next semester. I'll work 2 jobs if I have to. I'll make the $5,000 every month somehow." Then he said the words that shattered what remained of my broken heart. "Money can be earned again. But I only have one grandfather." While my own children were choosing luxury resorts for their vacations, my grandson was choosing to sacrifice his education just to save my life. My chest tightened as a powerful wave of emotion crashed through me. I looked into Tyler's sincere eyes, and for the first time in years I saw hope in humanity again. This boy was willing to give up his future for an old man his own parents treated like a burden. I broke down crying. But these tears were not born from pain. They came from being deeply moved beyond words. If you have stayed with us this far, please take one quick moment to subscribe. So many people watch without doing it, but it costs nothing and means everything to us. I squeezed Tyler's hand tightly. At that moment, I knew I had finally found the rightful heir to Percy's legacy. But Tyler still had no idea about the enormous secret I was carrying. He still believed I was dying and penniless. I stared at the envelope filled with my grandson's sweat-stained savings, and a new plan slowly began forming in my mind. A plan not only to punish the wicked, but to bless the good-hearted. I wiped away my tears and looked deeply into Tyler's eyes. I was about to tell him a truth that would change his life forever. But first, there was one final thing I needed to test. I looked at Tyler as he continued checking the medicine bottles on the table. He had no idea he had just passed one of the cruelest tests imaginable. I took a deep breath. The truth caught in my throat as I grabbed his rough hands worn from hard work. "Tyler," I said softly, "listen to me. I do not have a stroke, and I do not need your savings." Tyler froze. He stared at me in complete shock. Slowly I began telling him everything. About the phone call from Attorney Morrison. About my distant cousin Percy. About the $80 million inheritance, and about the cold-hearted betrayal of his own parents. Tyler sat there, speechless. Tears rolled down his face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. He threw his arms around me and thanked God that I was still healthy. Not once did he ask how much money he would receive. That alone shattered me in the best possible way. I cried again, this time from pure happiness. "You protected my future," I told him. "Now I am going to protect yours." I explained that this entire plan had been created to discover who truly deserved a place in my new life. Tyler had chosen loyalty over money. He had won a game his parents had lost completely. While my children were choosing luxury resorts for their vacations, my grandson was preparing to sacrifice his education just to save my life. That thought echoed endlessly in my mind. For the first time in years, I felt a new strength rising inside me. The weakness and hopelessness disappeared. In their place stood the determination of a man now holding the power to shape destinies. I told Tyler we would not spend another minute inside this damp, miserable house. We were going to Texas, to the massive ranch waiting for us, to the beginning of an entirely new chapter. But I was not ready to end this game yet, no. I wanted to see Melvin and Linda's faces when they realized what they had thrown away. A perfect transformation plan was already taking shape in my mind. I would return someday, but not as the pitiful old man they abandoned. And when they saw the new version of me standing before them, what would they do then? Tyler and I left the old house that very night. The journey to Texas became a true transformation. No more exhausted coughing, no more meals measured down to the last dollar. I walked into a luxury clothing store and bought myself the finest suit I had worn in over 20 years. When I looked into the mirror, I no longer saw the defeated old Stephen. I saw a man with power, a man with confidence. We finally arrived at the 2,000-acre ranch. It was a breathtaking paradise of endless green fields and a grand estate standing proudly beneath the Texas sky. I bought a powerful new pickup truck. I hired the best lawyers money could buy to protect Percy's legacy. My life had changed completely. But one thing remained exactly the same: my silence toward Melvin and Linda. My phone began vibrating nonstop. Melvin was calling. Linda was sending messages. Maybe they had heard rumors from old neighbors. Or maybe they suddenly realized that losing contact with me also meant losing control. I looked at their names, flashing across the screen, and smiled calmly. Then I pressed decline. The feeling was strange. I had spent my entire life trying to please them. But now I was the one controlling the game. I stood on the balcony of the mansion and watched Tyler laughing as he ran freely across the open fields. For the first time in years, the boy could return to school without worrying about tuition or survival. I had spent 63 years living according to everyone else's expectations. But from this day forward, people would have to earn a place in my life. Still, my silence was only the beginning of a much larger storm. Melvin and Linda were not the type to give up once they smelled money. They were already planning to come here. They believed a few fake apologies would be enough to get their hands on the fortune. What they did not know was that I had prepared a welcome they would never forget. The direct confrontation was coming. And when the truth was finally exposed, would they even dare to look me in the eyes? The roaring engine of a luxury SUV shattered the peaceful silence of the ranch. Melvin and Linda stepped out of the vehicle, their eyes sweeping across the massive estate with shock and greed. Linda rushed toward me, trying to throw her arms around me. In the sweetest voice imaginable, she said how worried she had been about me. She called me Daddy, as though that cold-hearted phone call from weeks earlier had never happened. Beside her, Melvin forced an awkward smile and complimented my suit, saying I looked incredibly distinguished. I stood there with my arms crossed, staring at them with eyes as cold as ice. I did not invite them inside. Instead, I remained on the front porch and calmly repeated every cruel word they had said to me. I asked Melvin about his new golf clubs. I asked Linda about the shiny SUV she could not sacrifice to save her father's life. Their faces shifted from pale to burning red with shame. Melvin stuttered that he had only been joking back then. Linda quickly blamed stress from work and claimed she had not been thinking clearly. I let out a dry, bitter laugh. It was no longer the laugh of a broken old man. It carried authority, power, finality. I have heard enough, I said. I spent my entire life building a foundation for both of you, and you treated me like a debt that needed to disappear. When I needed $5,000 to survive, you turned your backs on me. But the moment $80 million appeared suddenly, you remembered what family means. I looked directly into their eyes. I will no longer accept scraps of affection. Now I decide who deserves a place in my life. Then I motioned for Tyler to step forward. The moment Melvin saw his own son standing beside me, his expression froze in disbelief. I told them plainly that Tyler had been the only person willing to drive 800 miles to save me while his parents were busy enjoying luxury vacations and expensive hobbies. Your betrayal showed me who my real family truly is. Linda immediately burst into tears and began begging for forgiveness. Melvin tried using logic and excuses, desperately arguing about family rights and misunderstandings. But I had already turned away. I spent 63 years living for other people, I said, without looking back. From today onward, if either of you wants a place in my life, you will have to earn it. Those words hit them harder than any slap ever could. At that moment they understood the gates of this ranch had closed forever to the ungrateful. But the punishment was still not over. Because hidden inside the new will I signed that very morning was one final card. A final move that would leave Melvin and Linda drowning in regret for the rest of their lives. I stood there watching their SUV disappear into the cloud of dust, trailing along the dirt road, leading away from the ranch. In my hands rested the new will, officially signed and sealed by Attorney Morrison. I had made my final decision. Every dollar of the fortune, and every acre of this ranch, would belong to Tyler. The boy was not simply inheriting money. He was receiving the reward for the compassion and integrity his parents had thrown away long ago. I lowered myself into the armchair on the porch and quietly watched the blazing sunset paint the Texas fields in deep shades of red and gold. This feeling of peace was something $80 million could never buy. Only truth and inner peace could give a man that. For the first time in years, I no longer felt hatred, only relief. Melvin and Linda would now spend the rest of their lives carrying the memory of how cheaply they valued their father's life. They did not lose because I became rich. They lost because they were spiritually bankrupt. Money does not change people. It only reveals who they truly are. I had seen the real faces of the people I once loved most. But I had also discovered light in the place I least expected. Family is the one who stays when life becomes difficult, not the one who appears when money arrives. Share this story if you would choose loyalty over wealth. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind moving across the endless grasslands. For the first time in a very long while, I felt that I truly belonged somewhere. The journey from that miserable kitchen to this magnificent ranch was never only about becoming wealthy. It was about reclaiming my dignity. My story may end here, but the new life Tyler and I are building has only just begun. What would you do if you were faced with Percy's test? Leave your thoughts below, and thank you for staying with me until the very end. 6 months ago, I walked into a dining room filled with excitement and pride because my daughter had come home. But before that night was over, in a single moment, I realized that the child I had raised and protected for 36 years, Sienna, was sitting across from me with the intention of harming me for money. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. I'm Sterling Vance. Grab a drink, some snacks, get comfortable. And remember this, the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and subscribe, you're going to enjoy this one. $68 million. That was the exact amount sitting in my trust account. It was the price of 42 years spent fighting my way through the business world. And what did I get in return? A calculating look from my own daughter. Cordelia, my devoted wife, had been gone for less than 100 days. Her ashes rested in Lake Norman Cemetery, and the ground above them had barely settled. Yet our only daughter had already scripted a fateful dinner. Sienna walked into the house wearing an elegant black dress. She smiled. The smile was exactly like Cordelia's, but her eyes were completely empty. When had greed begun to hollow out her soul? The contrast tightened my chest. I had spent my entire life shielding her from every storm. I gave her black cards with no spending limit. I bought her the finest luxury apartment downtown when she wanted to move out on her own. I had believed that the bond between father and daughter was something beyond value. But to Sienna, this father's life was worth nothing more than the lifeless numbers written on the pages of a will. The familiar dining room suddenly felt suffocating. The faint scent of candles could not hide the smell of the betrayal that was about to unfold. The clinking of silverware against porcelain echoed with a dry, hollow sound. I watched my beloved daughter place food onto my plate. Her hand trembled slightly. An unusual touch of her handbag. The instincts of a businessman who had survived hundreds of major deals told me that something was wrong. My intuition had never failed me. The outrage rose into my throat as I realized the bitter truth. The child who once cried hysterically when she saw me cut my hand was now calmly staring at her father's glass of wine with a dark scheme in mind. I took a deep breath. This fight for survival had only just begun. I stared at the glass of deep red wine on the table. The light from the chandelier reflected off its still surface. It shimmered with an eerie glow. My mind drifted back 42 years. Back then, my entire fortune consisted of an old pickup truck and a head full of ambition. I drove that truck through freezing winter nights. I slept at roadside rest stops along the highway. This body had been pushed beyond its limits more times than I could count just to lay the first brick of what would become today's logistics empire. Through all those stormy years, Cordelia was always by my side. She shared dry loaves of bread with me. She stayed awake through countless nights, helping me count every small order. We built this empire with sweat, tears, and blood. When Sienna was born, I swore that my daughter would never have to endure even a fraction of the hardship we had faced. I wanted her to live the life of a princess. But I was wrong. Unlimited indulgence had raised a monster. Ever since Cordelia died, half of my world had collapsed. The other half was the irreparable fracture between Sienna and me. I tried to make up for it. I tried to talk to her, but every time we faced each other, all I saw was a wall of ice. The wooden bridge connecting father and daughter was cracking a little more each day under the weight of greed. She did not want my love. She wanted the enormous fortune under my control. She looked at the chairman's seat of the corporation like a starving tiger stalking its prey. I looked directly into Sienna's eyes. She quickly looked away and adjusted her collar. The silence surrounding the wine glass between us felt like a death sentence hanging in the air. I already knew what her next move would be. This betrayal was more than a slap in my face. It was a desecration of Cordelia's memory. I reached for the wedding ring on my finger. Fury and heartbreak merged into a single emotion. Tonight, at this very dining table, I would have to face an enemy I once called my daughter. But Sienna was not acting alone. The shadow behind her had finally stepped into the light. A familiar set of footsteps echoed from the dining room entrance. The man who walked in wore a smile that was far too perfect. A smile that sent a chill down my spine. Gideon Cross. My son-in-law walked into the room. He was wearing an expensive custom-tailored suit paid for with the very money I had earned through blood and sweat. His appearance was always so polished that it felt artificial. His hair was perfectly groomed. The smile on his lips was flawless. So flawless that it made people uneasy. He walked over to Sienna and placed a hand on her shoulder. A gesture of complicity. He bowed his head toward me with his usual respectful tone, but his eyes were filled with hunger. I knew exactly what lay beneath that polished exterior. Gideon was nothing more than a complete failure hiding behind the image of a businessman. 3 years earlier, he had burned through $2 million in a fraudulent real estate project. I had been forced to clean up the disaster to save my daughter from embarrassment. A year later, he managed to make another $5 million disappear in the cryptocurrency market. He was addicted to alcohol and drowning in enormous debts. Every time he failed, I was the one signing checks worth millions of dollars to rescue his hollow reputation. He saw me as a bottomless cash machine. But today my alcoholic son-in-law was behaving unusually well. He declined the glass of premium wine I offered him. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water. He said he was cleansing his body in preparation for a new project. My suspicions immediately rose to their highest level. A starving wolf does not suddenly refuse a good meal. It only means that it has set its sights on prey far larger. My life, the atmosphere around the dinner table grew thick and heavy. Gideon's arrival made the purpose of this dinner clearer than ever. He kept glancing at the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. He was counting the minutes. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. Bitterness rose in my throat. The daughter I loved most had chosen to stand beside this broken man against her own father. Gideon began pouring water into his glass. His eyes shifted toward Sienna. He gave a slight nod. A silent signal had been sent. I clenched my fist beneath the oak table. They thought I was a confused old man who could be led around by the nose, but they had forgotten who I was. I watched every one of Sienna's movements with absolute focus. Her hand drifted once again toward the expensive handbag beside her. The same action, repeated over and over, almost obsessively. Sienna's nervousness had gone far beyond her ability to control it. Around the dinner table, the occasional clink of silverware sounded strangely out of rhythm. I was not watching her eyes. I was watching those trembling hands. The counting discipline I had developed as a businessman allowed me to record everything with precision. The fourth time, she lightly tapped the strap of her crocodile leather Chanel handbag. The seventh time, she pretended to bend down and adjust the position of the bag beneath her chair. Then came the 11th time, her eyes fixed on the gold-plated clasp of the handbag. 11 touches in less than 15 minutes. For a man who had conducted thousands of negotiations, that was not an unconscious habit. It was the behavior of someone hiding a crime. The atmosphere in the dining room had become thick with pretense. Every now and then Gideon would tell a dull joke about the stock market. He laughed by himself. Sienna forced a polite smile in response. Her face looked pale beneath the chandelier light. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead even though the air conditioner was set to 20 degrees Celsius. Pain tore through me. The daughter I had once carried in my arms, the child I had stayed awake all night caring for whenever she had a high fever. Now she sat barely a meter away from me, counting down the moments until her father entered eternity. The silence surrounding the glass of red wine before me felt like a deadly trap. I maintained the calm expression of the chairman of a leading logistics corporation. I smiled and nodded at Gideon's flattery. But beneath the oak table, my fingers were clenched so tightly that they had turned white. My instincts rose stronger than ever. I could smell betrayal. I could see the cracks spreading across the wooden bridge of family devotion. Frustration and fury climbed into my throat, but I forced them back down. I needed proof. I needed to know exactly how they intended to strike. Suddenly, Sienna stood up. She said she needed to use the restroom to touch up her makeup. She carried the handbag with her, holding it possessively. Gideon remained at the table. He looked at me with a mysterious expression. Then he nudged my wine glass about 2 centimeters across the table. At that exact moment, the kitchen door opened slightly. A young waiter stepped out carrying a tray of fresh dishes. His eyes were not on the food. They were fixed directly on me. Filled with absolute panic, he was trying to send me a message with nothing but his eyes. A desperate warning. An urgent plea for help. My phone vibrated inside the pocket of my suit jacket. It was a call from the corporation's chief financial officer. I excused myself to Gideon and stepped out onto the nearby balcony. On the other end of the line, he confirmed a critical piece of information. The largest merger of the year had been completed. $68 million had officially been transferred into my secure personal account. An enormous sum. The crowning achievement of my business career, yet at that moment it brought me nothing but a chilling sense of dread. I ended the call and returned to the dining room. Sienna had not yet come back from the restroom. Gideon had temporarily left the table to take another phone call near the main foyer. At that moment, only Silas remained in the dining room with me, the young waiter who had just delivered the food tray. He approached to clear away the used plates. His hands were trembling uncontrollably. The porcelain dishes clattered softly against one another. Silas lowered his head. Pretending to wipe down the table, he leaned close to my ear. His voice was barely above a whisper, only loud enough for the two of us to hear. "Sir, while you were on the phone, your daughter put something into your wine." I froze. Shh. My heart pounded violently. The blood in my veins seemed to turn to ice. Silas's words struck me like a fatal knife driven straight into my chest. Pain tore through my soul. The brutal truth had been exposed in its rawest form. My own daughter truly wanted me dead. Silas looked up at me with frightened but determined eyes. He continued speaking quickly. He told me that his uncle had once worked for a wealthy family. His uncle had witnessed a similar poisoning scheme, but he had remained silent and spent the rest of his life haunted by regret. Silas did not want to watch that tragedy happen again. He swore that what he had seen through the crack of the kitchen door was completely real. I stared at the glass of dark red wine. It sat silently on the table like an invisible death sentence. The chandelier's light reflected through the liquid, giving it an unusual violet tint. The greed of Sienna and Gideon had transformed a celebratory drink into a poisoned cup meant to end a blood bond between father and daughter. 42 years in the business world had never prepared me for a nightmare like this. I took a deep breath to keep myself from falling apart. A surge of outrage and fury rose inside the 68-year-old man I had become. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Sienna was returning. At the same time, Gideon ended his call and walked back into the room, a trace of triumph hidden behind his smile. They looked at me. They looked at the poisoned wine. The deception had reached its peak. I had to make a decision immediately. Confront them and expose everything, or remain silent and set a trap of my own. Time was now measured in seconds. I picked up the wine glass. My hand did not tremble. I looked directly into my daughter's tense eyes, and in that instant a bold plan for a switch flashed through my mind. Sienna sat back down in her chair. She stared at my wine glass. Gideon had also returned to his seat. The familiar, flawless smile spread across his face. A brutal internal battle raged inside my mind. I wanted to jump to my feet. I wanted to throw that poisoned glass of wine directly into their faces. I wanted to scream and ask why the daughter I had raised for 36 years could be so cold-blooded. But the composure of a seasoned businessman stopped me. If I confronted them now, they would deny everything. They would destroy the evidence. I needed a perfect revenge. I needed them to bring down this performance with their own hands. I set the wine glass back on the table. Then I glanced towards Silas, who stood tensely in the corner of the room. I gave him a quick wink. Silas was surprisingly intelligent. He understood immediately. Carrying a tray of hot soup, he approached the dining table. Then he deliberately caught his foot on the edge of the oak table. A loud crash echoed through the room. The metal tray and 2 bowls of soup spilled onto the floor beside Gideon's chair. Hot soup splashed across Gideon's trousers. He jumped to his feet and began shouting curses. Sienna immediately turned toward him in alarm and helped him up while trying to clean the stain. For 5 seconds, both of them were completely distracted. 5 seconds that would define the course of my life. My 68-year-old hands moved with the speed of a master magician. Smooth, silent, invisible. I switched my wine glass with Sienna's. The 2 glasses were identical, but now the deadly liquid sat in front of my ungrateful daughter. The safe glass was in my possession. I withdrew my hand and adjusted the collar of my suit. Everything happened in an instant. Without the slightest sound, the illusion surrounding the wine glasses remained perfectly intact. After cleaning himself up, Gideon sat down again with an irritated expression. He shot Silas a razor-sharp glare. Silas lowered his head and mumbled an apology before quickly cleaning up the mess and retreating to the kitchen. The dining room returned to its earlier silence. But the balance of power had completely changed. The counter-trap had been set. Sienna let out a quiet breath of relief. She turned toward me. Her face struggled to regain its artificial cheerfulness. Then she picked up her wine glass. The poisoned wine now rested in her trembling hand. She raised the glass toward me. Gideon immediately lifted his own glass of water. I smiled, a cold smile filled with absolute contempt. Neither of them had any idea that disaster was now calling my daughter's name. Sienna began to speak. Her voice echoed through the suffocating room. The most horrifying chapter of this dinner had officially begun. Sienna raised her wine glass toward me. She smiled, a smile of deception brought to its absolute peak. She congratulated her father on the successful completion of the $68 million deal. She said she wanted to toast to a new beginning for our family after the loss of her mother, Cordelia. The words coming from my own daughter's mouth sounded sweet, yet they were as sharp and cold as blades stabbing into my heart. Sitting beside her, Gideon also raised his glass of water. His eyes sparkled with triumph. He believed the plan was perfect. He believed he was about to become the owner of an enormous fortune. I looked directly into Sienna's eyes. I raised my own safe glass of wine. I nodded slightly. I thanked them for this special dinner. I told them I would never forget this night. Sienna suspected nothing. She lifted the glass to her lips. She took a large sip. Then she drained it completely. The deadly liquid slid smoothly down her throat. I also took a sip from my own wine. Then I calmly set the glass down on the oak table. If you've followed the story this far, I'm sure it has stirred some emotions in you. Please help us with one small favor that only takes a moment. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and tell me your prediction for how the story will end to see if you're right. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. Everything happened so quickly. Gideon stared at me. The perfect smile on his lips suddenly froze. He waited. He waited for me to collapse. He waited for me to clutch my chest in agony. But 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds passed. I was still sitting there. I was still looking at him with a terrifying silence. The change in Gideon's expression was incredibly satisfying. His eyes widened in horror. He looked at my empty wine glass. Then he looked at Sienna's glass. Utter confusion was written across the face of the scheming man. At that exact moment, Sienna dropped her glass. The glass shattered across the floor. The sharp crash shattered the suffocating atmosphere. Sienna brought both hands to her throat, her face twisted in pain. She could not breathe. Her eyes looked at me in complete panic. Her body began to convulse violently. She collapsed onto the dining table, sending dishes and plates crashing to the floor. The poison spread far too quickly. It was far more powerful than I could ever have imagined. Gideon rushed toward Sienna and grabbed her. For the first time, he appeared genuinely panicked, but he was not worried about his wife's life. He was terrified because the plan had gone completely wrong. He looked at me with the eyes of an animal trapped with nowhere left to run. Gideon's screams echoed throughout the suffocating dining room. The fateful dinner had turned into a scene filled with blood and tears. Retribution had arrived far sooner than expected, but the true cruelty hidden behind my son-in-law's mask would not be fully revealed until the minutes that followed. Gideon frantically shook Sienna's shoulders. She had completely lost consciousness. Foam gathered around her mouth. Her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. The sight should have shattered the heart of any father, but my heart felt as cold as ashes. I stood silently at the head of the dining table. I looked at my son-in-law with the eyes of a judge observing a condemned man. Gideon's panic reached its peak. He pulled out his phone. His fingers were trembling so badly that he entered the wrong passcode 3 times. But he did not dial emergency services. He called an unknown number instead. In a furious whisper, he said that the plan had failed and that the poison had gone to the wrong person. The moment he noticed me approaching, he ended the call. The most infuriating moment came when I reached for my phone to call an ambulance. Gideon lunged forward. He slapped the phone from my hand. It crashed onto the floor, the screen shattering instantly. He stepped in front of me, his face twisted into the savage expression of a monster. He shouted that no one was allowed to call anybody. He was afraid the police would arrive. He was afraid doctors would discover the specialized poison he had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars obtaining through the underworld. He was willing to let Sienna slowly die on the dining table if it meant saving his own worthless skin. Disgust rose into my throat. This man possessed not a shred of humanity. He was willing to step over his own wife's body to protect himself. But he had made one fatal mistake. Silas had been standing at the dining room entrance for some time, holding a phone that was actively recording. And from outside, the distant sound of ambulance, sirens, and police vehicles was already growing louder. I had called them before I ever sat down at this dinner table. 10 minutes later, the emergency team rushed into the room. They placed Sienna onto a stretcher and immediately began resuscitation efforts. The lead physician looked at the spilled wine on the table. He collected a sample of the liquid and examined it. His expression changed instantly. He looked directly at Gideon before turning to the police officers who had just entered the room. The doctor stated with certainty that the quantity of poison involved was far too large to be accidental. This was an intentional attempted murder. Gideon stepped backward. His back struck the cold wall. He looked around the room and finally realized that the trap had completely closed around him. But evil people always have one last desperate move. As the officers approached, Gideon suddenly pointed straight at me. He shouted at the top of his lungs, accusing me of something horrifying, a false accusation that had the potential to turn the entire investigation upside down. Gideon pointed directly at me. He shouted at the police that I was the one who had poisoned my own daughter. He accused me of wanting to keep the entire $68 million for myself, and claimed that I had committed a cruel and ruthless act. Tears appeared on command. He played the role of a grieving husband who was about to lose his wife. The officers immediately turned their attention toward me with suspicion in their eyes. My silence only made them more cautious. But I was not worried. A seasoned businessman never enters a battle without preparing his weapons first. I gave a slight nod toward Silas. The young waiter stepped forward and handed his phone, still playing the recording, to the lead detective. Gideon's shouting in the dining room echoed clearly through the audio. The recording proved that he had tried to prevent anyone from calling for emergency help. It proved that he knew about the poison. The color instantly drained from Gideon's face. At that exact moment, a team of private investigators I had hired earlier entered the room. They carried a thick stack of documents. Justice was finally beginning to unfold in a deeply satisfying way. They presented evidence that Gideon could not deny. For months, he had secretly monitored my financial accounts. Most damning of all was a forged draft of my will bearing a counterfeit version of my signature. According to that document, if I died, my entire estate would transfer directly to Sienna. Immediately afterward, Gideon would gain full control over everything. An even more horrifying truth emerged when investigators examined Gideon's finances. He was carrying gambling debts totaling $400,000 with underground casinos. Every one of those debts had been signed in Sienna's name without her knowledge. He had pushed my daughter into a corner. He had turned her into an accomplice in a plan to kill her father in exchange for money to erase his debts. Pain and disgust rose to unbearable levels inside me. The daughter I had raised for 36 years had been manipulated by this broken man until she had lost all sense of humanity. The police immediately escorted Gideon to the hospital where Sienna was receiving emergency treatment so they could continue questioning him. There, in the hospital corridor, the psychological pressure finally shattered him. When a doctor informed him that Sienna might spend the rest of her life in a vegetative state, Gideon made a fatal mistake. In front of detectives, he shouted a single sentence. She wasn't supposed to drink that wine. That statement was the clearest confession possible. He had admitted that the wine had originally been intended for me. The most satisfying moment had finally arrived. The lead detective needed no further evidence. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. A sharp metallic click echoed through the hallway. Gideon's wrists were locked together on the spot. He collapsed to his knees on the cold hospital floor. The punishment he deserved was now waiting for him. But this story could not end there. As the first light of dawn slowly appeared on the horizon, I still had one final truth to face. Would my daughter wake up and live long enough to hear the final judgment from her father? Gideon Cross was sentenced to 27 years in prison without parole. It was a fitting price for his greed and cold-blooded cruelty. Sienna was fortunate to survive thanks to the doctor's timely intervention. But her brain suffered severe damage. She would spend the rest of her life confined to a wheelchair. Pain tears through my heart every time I look at my only daughter, who was once born with every advantage, now living with a permanent disability. But justice is justice. Betrayal always comes with a very high price. I did not abandon her. I established a conditional trust fund through a bank. The money is sufficient only to cover her medical expenses and professional care for the rest of her life. She will never again have access to a single dollar of that $68 million fortune. As for Silas, the kind-hearted waiter, I paid for his entire college education so he could fulfill his dream of earning a degree. He deserved a bright future after the quiet act of courage he showed that night. I stood alone on the balcony of my home overlooking Lake Norman. The first light of dawn was slowly breaking across the horizon. The lake's surface was calm and crystal clear, like a mirror reflecting my life back at me. 42 years of struggle in the business world had brought me success and wealth. Yet in the end, what remained was a cold dining room and a shattered family. Money does not destroy families. It merely reveals the truth that was already hidden inside them. Human greed is a bottomless abyss. If we fail to control it, it will consume everything we hold sacred. Sienna's betrayal left a deep scar on my heart, but I chose to face it and move forward. Overcoming betrayal is not about revenge. It is about refusing to let darkness become the final chapter of your life. This story is a reminder of the power of kindness between strangers. If you found value in it, please share it and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next awakening truth. Thank you for listening to my story. Cherish the people beside you before greed blinds them. Goodbye, and I will see you again. I hosted a party to celebrate my 60th birthday. My wife and my son handed me a gift. Inside it was a piece of paper that turned out to be an eviction notice and divorce papers. The business, the house, everything was gone. My son mocked me, saying I was a pathetic old failure. They burst out laughing. I signed the papers and walked out. But 1 week later, there were 32 desperate phone calls. The night breeze brushed softly across my face. The smell of honey-glazed ribs drifted through the air. Lanterns hanging from the old oak tree cast a warm golden glow. I stood in front of the grill holding the same pair of meat tongs I had used for years. Around me were the voices and laughter of neighbors and longtime business partners. Today I turned 60 years old. 60 years of life filled with struggle and hard-earned victories. I had built Hendrix Construction from absolutely nothing. I once carried heavy bags of cement under the burning sun just to create the foundation for everything I now owned. I looked toward the main table. Chloe, my wife, was smiling gracefully while talking with her friends. She was wearing the emerald silk dress I bought for her last year. Paul, my son, stood beside her. He held a glass of wine and carried himself like the successful businessman I had always been proud of. A deep sense of satisfaction filled my chest. I told myself that all the hardship I endured had finally been rewarded with a peaceful and happy family. Suddenly, Paul cleared his throat and lightly tapped his glass. The crowd fell silent and turned toward my son. "Dad, we have a special gift for you," Paul announced loudly. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket. Chloe stepped closer and placed her hand on my shoulder, her eyes shining with anticipation. "Open it, Robert," she whispered. I set the meat tongs down and wiped my hands on my apron. My heart began beating faster, a mixture of curiosity and emotion. I thought it might be tickets for a trip around the world, or maybe a family photograph framed in silver. Slowly, I opened the envelope and pulled out the papers inside. The very first line I saw made my breath catch in my throat. "Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. I am truly glad you are here. Make sure you subscribe to follow my story all the way to the end, and leave a comment with the city you are watching from so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Notice of termination of residency and eviction." I blinked, thinking I must have read it wrong. I turned to the next page. A unilateral divorce filing with terms that stripped me of every piece of our shared property. Everything inside my head started spinning. This house, this company, the bank accounts. None of it belonged to me anymore. I looked up at Chloe, hoping this was nothing more than a cruel joke. But her face had turned cold as ice. Her eyes were filled with a level of contempt I had never seen in 25 years of marriage. Paul stepped forward, tilting his chin at me with open arrogance. He leaned close to my ear, making sure I heard every poisonous word. "You are a pathetic old failure," Paul sneered. "Your time is over. Now it is time for you to disappear so I can run everything." Their laughter exploded right after that, loud and merciless. The guests around us began whispering, but not one person stepped forward to help me. I felt like a wounded animal being exposed in the middle of a crowd. The blood in my veins burned, then suddenly turned ice cold. I looked down at the papers, then at the fountain pen in Paul's pocket. "Give me the pen," I said, my voice dropping into something dangerously calm. Paul handed it to me with a victorious smile. I signed my name on those documents with firm, deliberate strokes. The scratching sound of the pen cutting across the paper felt like the sound of my own heart breaking. I removed the apron that said "World's #1 Dad." I placed it on the table right beside the plate of ribs, still steaming with heat. I did not say another word. I turned around and walked away, leaving behind the bright lights and the people who had betrayed me. I stepped out through the gate with less than $400 in my pocket. But in the middle of that collapse, a single thought flashed through my mind. They had forgotten who laid the foundation of this kingdom. I walked along the sidewalk of the wealthy neighborhood. Most of the mansions here had been built by my company. Every brick, every fence carried the mark of my sweat. I remembered 3 years ago when I became seriously ill. Chloe cried beside my hospital bed and said she needed power of attorney to protect the family. Because I loved her, because I trusted her, I signed without a single doubt. It turned out she had been preparing for this day from that very moment. She and my son had been quietly moving assets for a long time. They isolated me from major projects. They convinced me I was getting old and needed to step back. This betrayal hurt far more than any physical wound I had ever suffered. I stopped at an old gas station at the end of the street. I pulled out my worn wallet and checked inside. $327. That was all I had left after 30 years of devotion. Enough for one night at a cheap motel and a few simple meals. But when I looked at my reflection in the gas station window, I saw a man who had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. Paul thought he had won because he had the money. Chloe thought she had won because she had the house. But they were wrong. They had awakened an old lion that they should have left sleeping. I would not use a gun. I would not use a knife. I would take my revenge, using the same things that built my entire career: patience, strategy, and the cold precision of a master builder. This game had only just begun, and the ending would make them regret it for the rest of their lives. I staggered along the dark road. Paul's laughter still echoed faintly behind the iron gate. My mind drifted back to the winter of 2023. That was when the severe pneumonia made my lungs feel like they had frozen solid. I was lying in a hospital bed at the Central Medical Center. Around me was the lifeless beeping of heart monitors. Chloe sat beside me, her eyes red from crying. She held my hand, those warm hands I had trusted for so many years. "Robert, the company is in trouble without your signature," she sobbed. "The suppliers are threatening to stop deliveries. The workers are worried because they have not been paid." She placed a thick stack of documents in front of me. She said it was only a limited power of attorney to handle temporary matters, so that I could focus on recovering without worrying about the business. At that time, my mind was clouded by antibiotics and a fever that refused to break. I looked into my wife's eyes and saw nothing but sincere concern. I picked up the pen and signed exactly where she pointed. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I had signed a full power of attorney that could not easily be reversed. I had handed them the key to the treasure I spent 30 years building. The moment I was discharged from the hospital, the changes began quietly. Paul started changing the passwords to the internal management systems. He said it was to protect company information from competitors. Chloe began taking over every email account and every phone call from the banks. Whenever I wanted to review the books, they used my health as a shield. "Dad needs to rest. The doctor said you must not deal with stress," Paul would say. They arranged long vacations for me in distant places. It turned out that was their way of isolating me from my most loyal partners. They fired the master craftsmen who had fought beside me for decades. They replaced them with people who only knew how to obey Paul. Tonight, standing under the dim streetlight, I finally understood the entire truth. This birthday party had never been meant to celebrate my life. It was a victory celebration for two traitors. They waited until every legal procedure was completely finished. They waited until I no longer had any value left for them. Paul stepped out onto the balcony of the house and looked down at me standing outside the fence. He held a stack of documents and threw them into the air. Sheets of paper fluttered down like pale moths in the night. "Those are copies of the tax reports you signed," Paul shouted. "Everything is completely legal, dear father. You cannot sue. You cannot take anything back, because you were the one who handed it all to us with your own signature." I watched the papers fall into a dirty puddle beside the road. The anger inside me ignited, burning away the shock that had frozen me moments earlier. I had not only lost my home, I had lost my faith in people. I looked back at the mansion one last time. Those dazzling lights now looked more like a glittering tomb, a tomb that had buried my kindness and my trust. I turned away and walked toward the town center. I needed somewhere to rest and think. I needed to find the weakness in the perfect trap they had built around me. They believed I had been disarmed. They believed I was just an old man waiting to die in poverty. But they forgot something important. The blueprint of that entire house still existed inside my head, and I knew exactly which wall to strike to bring their whole structure crashing down. I would make them regret letting me walk out of that gate alive. I stopped in front of the flickering neon sign of the Sunset Motel. The letters S and T were broken, leaving only the word UNS glowing dimly through the light drizzle. It was the cheapest place I could find on the edge of town. I pushed open the stained glass door and stepped into the reception area. A middle-aged man with a scruffy beard looked at me with open suspicion. "One single room," I said, my voice rough from the cold. $50 a night." "Pay in advance," he replied shortly. I pulled a $50 bill from the small stack of cash in my wallet. My hand trembled slightly as I placed it on the scratched wooden counter. He handed me a metal key attached to a red plastic tag. "Room 12. End of the hallway on the left," he muttered, already turning back to the television. I walked down the hallway on a carpet that smelled of dampness and years of cigarette smoke. The door to room 12 opened with a dry squeal from hinges that had not seen oil in a long time. The space inside was cramped and suffocating. A single bed with a thin, worn blanket, an old television sitting on a crooked wooden shelf, and a small window overlooking a trash-scattered parking lot. I closed the door, locked it, and sat down on the edge of the bed. The weight of reality began pressing down on my chest. Just a few hours earlier, I had been the owner of a multi-million-dollar estate. Now I was sitting in a cheap room that even my workers would have complained about. I took out my wallet and emptied everything onto the mattress. A few wrinkled bills, my identification card, and the final balance on my phone's banking app, $327. I stared at my hands under the flickering fluorescent light on the ceiling. These calluses were proof of 30 years of labor. They had built dream homes for thousands of people, yet now they could not even hold onto a roof for the man who built them. I collapsed onto the bed, staring blankly at the stained ceiling. The loneliness of 60 years old crashed over me like a violent wave. I remembered the warm dinners I once shared with Chloe. I remembered teaching Paul how to read his very first construction blueprint. All of it had been a carefully staged performance. They had patiently waited for me to grow old. They had patiently waited for the moment I became vulnerable enough to take everything from me. The roar of a truck engine outside the motel startled me back to reality. I realized I could not lie here feeling sorry for myself. Their betrayal might have been a sentence, but I would turn it into a declaration of war. I sat up and opened the only bag I had managed to take with me. Inside there were no expensive clothes, only my identification papers and a small iron box. That box carried memories from the days when my parents were still alive. I placed my hand on the cold metal surface. In the darkness of the Sunset Motel, I made a silent promise to myself. Paul and Chloe might have taken my money, but they could never take my mind or my will. Tomorrow I would begin finding my way back, step by step, even if I had to start from the ashes. This rock bottom was not where my story ended. It was where I would begin laying a new foundation stronger than any structure I had ever built before. I reached over and switched on the old desk lamp. The weak yellow light trembled across the surface of the small iron box. It was the only thing I managed to grab when they forced me out of the house. Paul used to call it my pile of nostalgic junk. But to me, it was the last thread connecting me to the people who had truly loved me. I opened the lid. The dry scrape of metal echoed softly in the quiet room. Inside were a few medals from my college years, several black and white photographs of my parents, and a thick, light brown envelope resting at the bottom. Across the front, written in my mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "For Bobby." My throat tightened the moment my fingers touched her handwriting. My mother had been a frugal woman. She worked as a seamstress for years before opening a small bakery. She always told me, "A man needs an escape route when the storm comes, Bobby." I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were not old letters. It was a savings book and a stack of deposit certificates. I opened the book and the numbers seemed to dance under the dim light. The final deposit had been made 2 months before she passed away. With decades of accumulated interest, the balance had reached $91,000. I froze. $91,000. To a millionaire, it would be pocket change for a minor project. But to a man sitting at rock bottom with only $327 left, it was a fortune. It was my mother's blood, sweat, and silent sacrifice over an entire lifetime. She had hidden it away. She never told my father. She never even told me. As if she had somehow foreseen the day her son would lose everything. I shuffled through the remaining papers. A short letter slipped out, the ink slightly faded. "Bobby, if you are reading this, it means life has become difficult for you. Do not feel ashamed to accept help from your old mother. Use this to start again because you are the finest builder I have ever known." Tears fell onto the page, blurring the word builder. While I had been busy building castles for people who would betray me, my mother had quietly built a lifeboat for me. I gripped the savings book tightly in my hand. Chloe and Paul believed they had drained the last drop of blood from me. They had no idea that a mother's love could reach beyond death to protect her child. This money was not just capital. It was salvation. It was proof that I was not alone in this fight. I looked out the small window. In the distance, the city lights still burned brightly. The plan for my revenge began to take shape more clearly in my mind. I would not waste a single dollar. That $91,000 would be the first brick, the brick that would shatter Paul's arrogance, the brick that would throw Chloe out of the house she had stolen. I placed the savings book back into the iron box and locked it carefully. Tonight, for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of calm. Their betrayal had been a death sentence for family bonds, but it had also been the rebirth of my strength. "Sleep, Robert," I told myself. "Tomorrow, the hunt begins." I was about to close the iron box when my fingers brushed against another rough layer of paper. It was wedged beneath the lining at the bottom of the box. I pulled it out carefully. It was an old land ownership certificate, yellowed with age, stamped sometime in the 1970s. The document listed the owner as my Uncle Thomas, my late bachelor uncle, who had passed away many years ago. A faint memory returned to me. He had left me a piece of land on the northern edge of the city. At the time, I had been at the peak of my career, managing dozens of multi-million-dollar construction projects. That 12-acre patch of weeds and gravel had felt more like a tax burden than an asset, so I forgot about it completely. Paul and Chloe certainly had no idea it even existed, because it had been inherited directly from the Hendricks family long before I married Chloe. I opened my phone, dust still clinging to my fingers, and started searching through the city planning maps. My heart began pounding when I saw the location on the newest satellite map. The land sat right along the border of the North Technology Development District. The city had recently announced plans to expand the roadway and build a new belt route cutting directly through that area. Property values there had skyrocketed over the past 2 years. What had once been worthless wilderness was now a potential gold mine. I checked several recent land transactions nearby. $137,000 per acre. 12 acres. The number forming in my mind forced me to hold my breath to stay calm. This was the leverage I needed. They believed they had taken everything by freezing the company accounts. But they could not touch what they did not know existed. The legacy of the Hendricks family was rising to protect the last heir who still carried its integrity. I looked out the window of the Sunset Motel as darkness slowly retreated before the first light of dawn. A detailed plan began forming in my mind like a three-dimensional architectural blueprint. I would not sell the land immediately for quick cash. I would use it as collateral to rebuild my legal credibility. I would construct a new fortress on the very foundation they had overlooked. Chloe wanted money. She would watch money turn to dust. Paul wanted power. He would watch power collapse beneath the feet of the father he had mocked. I carefully placed the land certificate back into the box beside my mother's savings book. Tomorrow morning, my first destination would not be my old company. It would be the office of an old friend, the only man honest enough to stand against Chloe's army of lawyers. I lay down, but my eyes refused to close. I could still see Paul laughing at me during the party. Laugh while you can, my son. You took away what I built over 30 years. But I will take back everything, and the souls of the traitors along with it, and I will do it within a few short months. This battle is no longer about money. It is about proving that a true builder can never be defeated by those who only know how to steal the work of others. The sun had risen, and with it came the beginning of their end. 8 in the morning. I stood in front of the office building of Tom Bradley. Tom was an old lawyer known throughout the city for his integrity and for legal counterattacks that showed absolutely no mercy. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, and a brass bell rang sharply. Tom looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses. His thick eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Robert, I heard about the party last night," he said quietly. "The whole city is talking about how your wife and son threw you out of your own house." I placed my bag on his desk and pulled out my mother's savings book and the yellowed land certificate. "I did not come here for sympathy, Tom," I replied coldly. "I came for justice." We spent the next 6 hours dissecting every detail of the documents. Tom studied each page of the power of attorney I had signed in the hospital. His eyes stopped at a small clause near the bottom of the final page. "They were clever," Robert, Tom said, tapping the paper lightly. "They inserted a clause allowing the appointed party to transfer shared marital assets. But in their greed, they made a fatal mistake." I held my breath. Tom slid my Uncle Thomas's land certificate back across the desk. "This property is separate inherited land from before your marriage. Under the law, even with a full power of attorney, they cannot legally transfer or control separate inherited property without explicit written consent from you for that specific purpose. And that is not all." Tom gave a faint knowing smile. "Your mother's savings account is also a direct personal inheritance. Any attempt by Chloe to merge it into marital assets or freeze it would be illegal." A surge of electricity ran through my spine. The wall they built was beginning to crack. Tom continued flipping through company documents related to Paul's management. He fired the old accountants and replaced them with his own people. "That is a classic sign of someone trying to hide questionable financial flows," Tom said calmly. I looked him in the eyes, feeling the fire of revenge growing stronger. I want the power of attorney revoked immediately, I said firmly. And I want you to draft a notice to the banks establishing my exclusive ownership of the northern land. Tom nodded, his fingers already moving quickly across the keyboard. We are not just going to defend ourselves, Robert. We are going to strike their weakest point, their arrogance. I will submit the revocation of the power of attorney at the exact moment they are executing a major financial transaction. Their accounts will freeze at the very moment they believe they have already secured victory. I left Tom's office late in the afternoon. In my pocket was now a perfectly structured legal strategy. I walked down the street, watching the crowds moving quickly through the city. Chloe and Paul were probably enjoying their luxurious life inside my house. They had no idea that the sword of justice had already begun to slide out of its sheath. My silence today was not surrender. It was preparation for a storm they could never imagine. Everything they built on deception was about to collapse like a sandcastle before the tide. I did not stop with the lawyer's office. Real revenge requires more than legal paperwork. It requires the naked truth about your enemy. I used a small portion of my mother's money to hire an independent financial investigator. He was an old bloodhound of a man I had once helped when he was just starting out. 2 days later, we met at a quiet diner on the edge of town. He slid a thin folder across the table, but its contents carried enormous weight. Your son is not the business genius he thinks he is, Robert, he said. Paul is a professional debtor in the online gambling world. I opened the folder and felt my chest tighten. Paul had lost more than $200,000 on illegal offshore betting platforms. To cover those losses, he had done something unforgivable. He had secretly mortgaged the family home for $185,000. The house where I personally laid every single brick of the foundation. The house Chloe once swore she loved more than her own life. But that was not the end of it. Hendrik's construction had become nothing more than an empty shell. Paul had been using deposits from new construction projects to pay off his personal gambling debts. He now owed wages to workers and payments to dozens of subcontractors and material suppliers. A rot deep to the bone was spreading through the heart of the empire I built. He had not only betrayed me, he was destroying the Hendricks legacy itself. I scanned the list of stalled projects. One name stood out immediately: the Morrison Estate Project. Margaret Morrison was one of my most respected and demanding clients. She was known for having zero tolerance for delays or compromised quality. At that moment, I realized I had found their Achilles heel. Paul was desperately trying to keep everything hidden by using the power of attorney to drain the company's remaining reserve funds. If I cut off that financial lifeline now, the entire structure he built would explode. Creditors would descend like vultures smelling blood. And Chloe would finally realize that the son she protected was nothing more than a reckless destroyer. The truth was more bitter than I expected. But it gave me an absolute advantage. I did not need to destroy them myself. All I had to do was allow their greed and stupidity to destroy them. I paid the bill, gathered the folder, and stepped outside into the harsh sunlight. Inside my mind, a new move had already been placed on the board. I would contact Margaret Morrison. I would show her the truth about the man currently managing her project. And I would offer her a solution she could not refuse. Paul believed he had already won by taking control of the Hendricks name. But he forgot something important. Clients trusted that name because of me. Without credibility, a name is nothing more than a piece of paper. I tightened my grip on the folder, feeling strength returning to my bones. My enemies were digging their own grave. My only job now was to make sure there was no escape when the ground finally collapsed beneath them. I sat in my temporary office, a narrow room that still smelled of fresh paint. On the glass door, the words Hendricks Renovations were still drying. This was the new company I had just established using the money my mother saved for me. I picked up my phone. My finger hovered over one name: Margaret Morrison. She was a steel-willed woman who never tolerated delays. I pressed the call button. "Robert, I thought you retired to some island somewhere." Her sharp voice came through the phone. "I did not retire, Margaret. I am just cleaning up the ruins," I replied. I told her the truth about Paul's financial situation and the reality behind the construction of her mansion. Her face must have turned pale when she heard the number tied to my son's gambling debts. 1 hour later, we met at the stalled construction site. Machines stood silent. Workers sat around talking, unpaid and restless. Mrs. Morrison watched as Paul tried desperately to explain something to a material supplier who was demanding payment. My son looked pathetic in his expensive suit, his eyes darting around in fear. I stepped out from the shadow of the corridor. Paul froze. The coffee cup in his hand trembled. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he stammered. I did not answer him. I looked straight at Margaret Morrison. "I will take over this project with my new company," I said calmly. "I do not need a deposit. All I need is for you to sign a direct contract with me. I will personally cover the material costs using my land as collateral." Mrs. Morrison nodded without hesitation. "Paul, you are fired," she said coldly. I watched my son's face change from red to ghost white. "You cannot do this. You signed power of attorney to Mom," he shouted. That was when I pulled the notice from Tom Bradley out of my folder. "That power of attorney was revoked at 8 this morning, Paul," I said slowly. "Every account you plan to use to cover your gambling debts has been frozen for investigation. You do not have a single dollar left to move around anymore." He collapsed onto the ground among the scattered bricks and concrete. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was a defeated man staring into the abyss. If you have stayed with this story until this moment, please take a quick second to subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs nothing, and it helps us more than you know. I turned and walked away, ignoring the angry shouting of creditors who were now surrounding Paul. If this story meant something to you, press like and help share the message about resilience. My journey to reclaim justice was now 3/4 complete. Every step I took now was calculated like an architectural blueprint. I knew Chloe was probably at home at that very moment, trying to use her credit cards, only to have them rejected. Soon she would realize that the luxurious house she stole had become nothing more than a cage without food. I returned to my small office and opened the project blueprints for the Morrison estate. I would work through the night. I would rebuild the reputation of the Hendricks name with these very hands. Paul and Chloe believed they could steal my career with paperwork, but they forgot something. A career does not live on paper. It lives in the trust of the clients. And that trust is something they were never worthy of owning. Tonight, I will sleep deeply, because tomorrow the 32 desperate phone calls I promised you about will finally begin ringing. The circle is about to close, and satisfaction will belong to those who stood with integrity. Monday morning. I sat in my new office with a cup of black coffee, no sugar. The phone rested quietly on the wooden desk, silent, like a ticking bomb waiting to explode. I had already sent every piece of evidence of Paul's embezzlement to the board of directors and the company's largest creditors. I had also filed a formal request to freeze the house since it had been illegally mortgaged. At exactly 9:15, the desk began to vibrate. The first call, Paul. I let it ring until it stopped. The fifth call, still Paul. By the 10th call, it was Chloe. I answered, but said nothing, only listening. "Robert, what have you done? Why was my card declined at the grocery store?" Chloe screamed, her voice shaking with humiliation. "Creditors are standing at the front door. They are trying to repossess Paul's car. You have to unlock the accounts right now." I hung up without saying a word. The phone kept vibrating violently on the desk. Call 15. Call 20. Then call 30. Paul started sending frantic messages, shifting from threats to desperate begging. "Dad, please, I am begging you. They are going to send me to prison. I just had a little bad luck. You cannot be this cruel. I am your only son." I looked at the messages, my heart cold as winter stone. When they threw me out of the house on my birthday night, did they remember I was their husband and father? The 32nd call came as the sun was setting. I turned on the speaker. Paul's sobbing voice filled the room, mixed with Chloe's shouting and the voices of repossession agents in the background. "Dad, please. They are sealing the house. I have nowhere to go." I took a deep breath. My voice echoed calmly through the empty office. "Paul, you called me a pathetic old failure. You said my time was over. So why would a successful man like you need to beg a failure? You lost the only person who would have helped you the moment you chose to betray me. There is no we here anymore. There is only you and the consequences you created." He cried out, his voice breaking. "Are you just going to let me die like this?" "I am not abandoning you," I replied coldly. "I am simply letting you stand on the same feet you used to kick me out of my own home. Goodbye, Paul." I ended the call. That was the final one. Outside the window, I watched tow trucks pulling away their luxury cars. Chloe stood in the yard with 2 suitcases beside her, her face stunned as if she still could not believe what had happened. That shining mansion, those bright lights, were now nothing more than cold concrete that no longer belonged to them. Justice does not always come from a courtroom. Sometimes justice is simply allowing greedy people to taste the same cruelty they once delivered to others. The circle had closed. And tonight I was the only one who still had a real home to return to. A home built on truth, not on deception. 1 year later, I sat on the porch of a small but elegant villa that I designed and built with my own hands. Hendricks Renovations had become a leading company in the heritage restoration field. Half of my Uncle Thomas's land had been sold, giving me complete financial freedom. The remaining money I used to establish a scholarship fund for construction students who come from difficult backgrounds. I later heard that Chloe was now working at a roadside diner in another state. She serves the very people she once would not even look at. Paul is currently going through rehabilitation and working manual labor jobs to slowly pay off his debts. I do not hate them, but I will never go back. Some doors once closed should never be opened again. I watched the sun slowly setting behind the city's new buildings. Life has taught me one simple truth. It is never too late to start again. You can lose every possession you have, but if you keep your dignity and your strength, you can rebuild everything. What do you think about my journey? Do you believe I should forgive my son? Let me know your thoughts below. Do not forget to press like and share if this story gave you strength. I am Robert, and this is Dad's Real Life Revenge. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I smiled and took a sip of tea. The future ahead felt wide open and peaceful, because now I know that every brick I place from this moment forward will be a brick built on truth. Dad, we've made our decision. We're selling the house at Kerr Lake. You have until the end of the month to move out. Every single word hit my ears. Clear, cruel. I felt my chest tighten like a steel beam collapsing under too much pressure. This house was not just wooden walls. It was my blood, my sweat, my entire life. It carried the soul of Renee, my late wife. And now the son I sacrificed everything to raise was ordering me out like I was some old piece of furniture. It was a windy May morning at Kerr Lake. I was sitting by the dock watching the waves roll softly against the wooden posts. My phone vibrated on the table. Brad, my oldest son. 8:14 in the morning. I answered the call. Before I could even say hello, his cold, arrogant voice cut through the line. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not care what I was doing. He went straight to business like a man clearing out unwanted inventory. I stayed silent. My hand tightened around the armrest of the chair. Rage climbed into my throat like fire. I am a structural engineer. I spent my entire life calculating pressure, stress points, and structural failure, but I failed to calculate the breaking point in my own son's character. Brad kept talking in that superior tone. He said the real estate market was hot. He said I was too old to live alone in such a large house. He said he had already found a buyer. He had even signed a brokerage agreement without asking for my permission. Not once. He treated me like a confused old man who would simply obey. Betrayal always tastes bitter, but betrayal from your own blood tastes like destruction. He wanted to sell this house for a few $100,000 to fund the lifestyle of his new wife. They thought I had outlived my usefulness. They thought I was powerless. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Settle in because this story is going to take you a long way. Hit the like button and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Brad ended the call with a fake little reminder as if he were doing me a favor. I placed the phone down on the table and stared across the lake. Suddenly the anger disappeared. In its place came something far more dangerous. Calm. A cold smile slowly spread across my face. A house can only stand if the foundation is strong. Brad and Tim wanted to tear mine apart. What they did not know was this: an engineer always keeps a backup blueprint. After the long beep from Brad's call finally faded away, the world around me became strangely silent. I sat motionless in the old armchair. My eyes drifted down to the cedar floorboards beneath my feet. Time had faded their color, but they were still solid and unshaken. I am a structural engineer. My entire life has revolved around blueprints, concrete, and load-bearing structures. I understand the value of a strong foundation better than most people. And this house at Kerr Lake was the greatest structure I ever built. I started building it in the spring of 1993. Back then, Renee and I had only been married a few years. We did not have much money, but we had enormous dreams. I still remember the feeling of pouring the first concrete foundation with my own hands. Every brick carried my sweat and my wife's smile. Renee stood right there on the porch corner, holding a glass of lemonade, her eyes glowing with excitement as our dream slowly rose from the ground. Together, we picked every wooden panel and every screw. I designed this house to survive the harshest Wisconsin winters. For more than 30 years, its structure had never trembled before a single storm. This was the house where Brad and Tim took their first steps. This was the house that held their childhood laughter. And this was the house that carried the final warmth of Renee before illness took her away from me. Every corner of this place carried her spirit. To me, this house was part of my soul. It was legacy. It was love. It was the final promise connecting me to my late wife. But to my sons, it was nothing more than property converted into cash. Brad and Tim looked at these walls and saw numbers. They either forgot or chose to forget that this very house had raised them into men. Selling it was like taking a hammer and smashing apart the memory of their own mother piece by piece. The pain inside me slowly turned into heartbreak. I lifted my eyes toward the family photo hanging in the living room. Renee was smiling in the picture, holding our two young boys in her arms. How had those innocent little boys become this cold and greedy? The warmth of memory vanished beneath the weight of reality. My sons had changed. Somewhere along the way, the rust of greed had begun eating through this family, and I had been too blind to see it. But Brad and Tim underestimated their engineer father. They thought I would cry, beg, or quietly pack my belongings and leave in humiliation. They believed they controlled the entire game after deciding the fate of my property without permission. What they failed to understand was this greed makes people blind, and blind people always miss the most important structural flaw. This battle had only just begun, and I had already found the fatal crack in their cruel little plan. The betrayal born from greed does not arrive like an explosion. It spreads like rust, quietly eating away at the load-bearing structure of a house. Slowly, patiently, corroding everything from the inside out. And by the time you finally notice it, the entire structure has already collapsed. As I sat there, I realized with bitter clarity that my family had been destroyed by that same silent corrosion. The one behind it all was Brad. My oldest son used to be a good kid. But everything changed after he married his new wife. She had an endless appetite for luxury. Designer clothes, expensive vacations, flashy parties meant to impress strangers who did not care about them. Brad's salary could never keep up with the bottomless greed she carried inside her. Financial pressure slowly transformed him into an arrogant and selfish man. He stopped seeing my home as family. He started seeing it as a lifeboat for his dying bank account. And then there was Tim, my younger son. He was not the mastermind, but he was something worse in his own way. A coward. Tim had always been afraid of his older brother. He had no backbone, no conviction of his own. Deep down, he knew forcing their father out of his home was wrong. He knew selling the house behind my back was unforgivable. But he nodded anyway. His weakness disgusted me almost more than Brad's cruelty. I spent my entire life teaching my sons about honor, gratitude, and responsibility. And in the end, what did I get in return? Two grown men circling their own father like vultures, waiting to strip away the last roof over his head. For the first time, I began to feel uneasy. Not for myself, for what they might do next. Because greed never stops once it awakens. They had already hired a realtor without permission. They had already given me a deadline to leave my own home, which meant they had likely prepared something far more calculated behind the scenes. I looked out the window toward Kerr Lake. The sky had darkened. A real storm was coming. But my sons had made one critical mistake. In construction, even the smallest crack in a blueprint can bring down an entire skyscraper. Brad and Tim were amateurs trying to outplay a veteran engineer. They thought I was old, weak, confused. They believed I knew nothing about the schemes unfolding behind my back. What they did not realize was this: overconfidence is the deadliest structural flaw of all. And that flaw was about to lead them straight into a trap they would never see coming. The next phone call on Sunday would expose every ugly truth hiding beneath their smiling faces. Just as I predicted, the next call came on Sunday. That day, rain poured endlessly from the sky. Heavy drops slammed against the windows as if they were trying to shatter the last traces of peace left inside the house. Then my phone rang. This time, it was a group call from both Brad and Tim. I turned on speakerphone. Brad's voice came first, carrying the same impatient, arrogant tone as always. But this time, I could also hear Tim's weak, guilty muttering in the background. Brad wasted no time. He announced that they had officially signed a contract with a real estate agent named Mark Benson. According to him, the house at Kerr Lake had been appraised at $390,000, a pathetic number, an insult to a solidly built home sitting on prime lakefront property. But my sons were desperate for money. They were willing to sell their mother's memories and throw their father out onto the street as long as cash arrived quickly enough. I asked them only one question, my voice perfectly calm. "You signed a contract without asking me first." Brad laughed softly through the phone. He said it did not matter. He said Mark Benson was a professional and had already found a buyer willing to pay within the month. That was when Tim finally spoke. He told me I should cooperate. He said moving into a small apartment downtown would be better for someone my age. They worked together surprisingly well. One pushed, the other pretended to comfort. Together, they were trying to corner me. Anyone listening to this would feel furious. My own sons were making decisions about the life of the man who had spent decades feeding them, protecting them, and building their future with his bare hands. Inside me, the pressure reached its breaking point. The pride of a father was being trampled. The dignity of an engineer was being mocked. They truly believed I was nothing more than a harmless obstacle standing in their way. Then Brad crossed the final line. In a cold voice, he said that if I refused to move out willingly, they would hire people to pack my belongings for me. The cruelty of those words went beyond anything I had imagined possible. I took a deep breath to hold back the rage boiling inside my chest. I did not yell. I did not cry. And suddenly the silence on my end made them hesitate. They mistook my silence for surrender. They thought the old man was finally broken. Brad ended the call after reminding me about the signing appointment scheduled for the following week. Then, the line went dead. I sat alone in the darkness of the room while the rain continued crashing outside. They thought they had won. They thought they had trapped me with nowhere left to run. But they were wrong. The battle had only begun. The moment the call ended, I stood up and walked toward my office. It was finally time to open the locked security drawer, because hidden inside that drawer was a weapon powerful enough to destroy their entire plan. I walked into my office in complete silence. Outside, the rain continued hammering against the windows, but inside me, the storm had settled. I was no longer angry. A good engineer never lets emotion take control when a structure is on the verge of collapse. I stepped toward the old oak desk. Beneath the right corner was a drawer that always remained locked. I called it the serious drawer. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver key. The sharp click of the lock echoed through the empty room. Then I opened the drawer and removed a thick blue folder. It had been sitting there untouched since 2016. Inside were the documents for my second property, a place called Garrison Lake Lodge. The lodge sat deep inside an isolated pine forest somewhere in Wisconsin. No one in my family knew it existed. Not Brad. Not Tim. No one. Back in 2016, after completing a massive construction project, I used my personal savings to quietly purchase the land. Over the years, I secretly transformed it into one of the most luxurious private retreats in the region. I had planned to reveal it as a surprise inheritance for my sons after my death. It was the only legal inheritance they had left. A strange mixture of curiosity and disappointment rose inside me as I flipped through the pages. Photographs of the lodge appeared one after another. The massive stone fireplace. The handcrafted cedar interior. The private lake hidden behind walls of towering pine trees. Its value had skyrocketed over the years. Meanwhile, my sons were desperately clawing over the $390,000 from selling the old Kerr Lake house. They had no idea that their blind greed was about to cost them something worth many times more. I slowly ran my hand across the folder. Their betrayal had finally helped me make a clear decision. My backup blueprint was ready. And now it was time to activate it. I carefully placed the documents into a black leather briefcase. They wanted to play a cruel game with me. Fine. I would play along. I would stay silent and let them keep performing their little victory dance all the way to the closing table. Tomorrow I would meet with my lawyer. and together we would prepare the perfect trap. The next morning I drove downtown to the office of attorney Raymond Castillo. The rain had stopped, but puddles still covered the streets, reflecting the dull gray sky above. A strange mixture of anticipation and tension kept my mind razor sharp. On the passenger seat beside me rested the black leather briefcase containing the Garrison Lake Lodge documents and the legal paperwork for the Kerr Lake house. By then, my home at Kerr Lake had officially been listed online for $390,000. When I saw the listing price, I almost laughed. My sons were fools. They believed they were walking away with a fortune. They had no idea they were throwing away a treasure for pennies just to satisfy temporary greed. And somehow, that insult only strengthened my resolve. I entered Raymond's office a few minutes later. Raymond Castillo had been my lawyer and close friend for years. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a look filled with concern. He had already reviewed the documents I sent him earlier. I sat down calmly and explained my plan. I told him I would not resist. I did not want shouting matches or ugly confrontations with Brad and Tim. Instead, I wanted him to prepare every legal document necessary for the sale. But everything had to happen exactly according to my script. Raymond stared at me in disbelief. He asked if I was truly willing to let my sons go this far. I looked him directly in the eyes and answered in a cold, steady voice. Let them finish their performance. A good engineer never puts out a fire the moment it starts. I'm going to let the fire of their greed grow as large as possible right there at the closing table, and at the exact moment they believe victory is finally theirs, I'll remove the one support beam holding everything together. That was the beginning of my silent game. For the entire following week, I completely cut off contact with both of my sons. I ignored every call, every message, every voicemail. My silence convinced Brad and Tim that I had finally broken down and accepted my fate. A few days later, they sent me the details for the closing appointment at the Lakeland office. Their message was short and cold. Bring your identification. Be there on time. I read the text message slowly and smiled to myself. The blueprint was complete. Every piece was now in position. My silence had become the most dangerous weapon of all. Brad and Tim were confidently marching toward the Lakeland office, without realizing that the room waiting for them was no longer a closing office. It was a legal execution chamber built specifically for them, and in the next chapter, the shock waiting inside that room would shatter everything they thought they controlled. On the morning of the closing, I arrived at the Lakeland office 15 minutes early. The air inside felt heavy, thick with the smell of expensive perfume and polished leather. Tension pressed against my chest like concrete settling under massive weight. I sat silently in the corner of the room, one hand gripping the black leather briefcase beside me. Exactly at 9 o'clock, Brad walked in. Confidence radiated from every step he took. He wore an expensive tailored jacket and polished leather shoes that gleamed beneath the office lights. His face carried the bright excitement of a man convinced he was about to strike gold. He glanced at me with fake sympathy before casually taking the seat across from me. Brad kept scrolling through his phone, smirking to himself. I knew exactly what he was doing. Counting money that did not belong to him yet. A few moments later, Tim entered the room. Unlike his brother, he avoided looking at me altogether. His head stayed lowered, guilt written all over his face. Then the buyers arrived. Mr. and Mrs. Marsh entered alongside the realtor Mark Benson. They carried thick folders filled with paperwork. The closing table was finally complete. Benson quickly spread the contracts across the table and pushed them toward Brad with eager hands. Brad grabbed the pen immediately. Without hesitation, he scribbled his signature across the seller's section, as though the house already belonged to him. Then he turned toward me with that same arrogant tone. Dad, your turn. Sign it so we can finish this quickly. Every eye in the room shifted toward me. The contrast between us could not have been clearer. Brad sat there, polished, impatient, intoxicated by greed. Meanwhile, I remained perfectly still, cold, solid, like reinforced concrete. I stared silently at the papers in front of me. This was the moment my son's cruelty reached its peak. They truly believed I would sign away my own home and quietly accept exile from the house I built with my bare hands. Slowly, I placed the leather briefcase on the table. The silence in the room suddenly changed. Brad's smile stiffened. For the first time all morning, uncertainty flickered across his face. He tapped his fingers impatiently against the table. What are you waiting for, Dad? People are waiting. I still said nothing. I simply looked directly into his eyes. It was the cold stare of an engineer who had finally located the fatal fracture inside a collapsing structure. Then I reached into my jacket pocket, but not for a pen. If you've made it this far into the story, then it probably stirred something inside you. Help us out with one quick thing. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you're still here. A lot of people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. I pulled out my phone. The screen displayed an incoming call from attorney Raymond Castillo. Without breaking eye contact with Brad, I placed the phone directly in the center of the closing table and turned on speakerphone. Then Raymond's firm voice filled the room, and in a single moment the entire atmosphere changed. Attorney Raymond Castillo's voice came through the speakerphone, sharp and unwavering. Good morning, everyone at the Lakeland office. This is attorney Raymond Castillo, legal representative for Mr. Jude Logan. I have an urgent announcement. The sale of the Kerr Lake property must stop immediately. This contract has absolutely no legal validity. The room fell into dead silence. Brad's arrogant smile vanished instantly. He shot up from his chair, his face burning red with rage. What are you talking about? He shouted into the phone. I'm his son. My brother and I have full authority over this property. Across the table, realtor Mark Benson suddenly began sweating as he frantically flipped through the paperwork. But Raymond's voice remained calm, cold, precise, like a blade sliding through steel. You are mistaken, Brad. You and Tim are listed as heirs under your late mother's estate. However, you failed to read the attached conditions carefully. According to Renee Logan's will, the Kerr Lake house remains under the sole ownership authority of Mr. Jude Logan until the day of his death. Any sale, transfer, or financial agreement requires his direct written consent and signature. Your attempt to sign documents and hire a realtor without your father's authorization is a direct legal violation. This transaction is now officially frozen, and just like that, the truth detonated in the middle of the room. The engineer's strike had landed perfectly. A deep sense of satisfaction rose inside my chest as I watched my son's entire scheme collapse beneath them. Justice had finally arrived. A good engineer always leaves behind a backup design. Brad and Tim thought they could outsmart a man who spent his entire life calculating structural weaknesses and failure points. They were wrong, completely wrong. The buyers, Mr. and Mrs. Marsh, immediately stood from the table in outrage. They felt deceived and manipulated. Within seconds, they gathered their paperwork and announced they were canceling the deal entirely. Before leaving, they threatened legal action against Mark Benson's brokerage company. Benson looked like all the blood had drained from his body. He turned toward Brad with pure hatred burning in his eyes. And then came the collapse. Brad dropped back into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The polished confidence from earlier was gone. Now there was only panic. Pure panic. He looked up at me with trembling eyes. Dad, why would you do this to us? We really need this money. Beside him, Tim had started crying, quietly begging for forgiveness under his breath. I slowly stood from my chair and buttoned my jacket calmly. Then I looked at my sons. But I no longer saw my children. I saw two greedy men completely blinded by their own hunger. I looked directly at Brad and spoke only once. You were willing to sell your mother's memory for $390,000. Greed has made both of you blind. Then, I picked up the black leather briefcase from the table. The battle at the Lakeland office was over, and my sons had suffered a humiliating defeat. But I was not finished yet. That was only the first strike, only the first crack destroying the illusion they had built around themselves. Because I still had one final blow waiting for them, one number so massive, it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. I did not rush to leave the Lakeland office. Instead, I stood there quietly, looking down at my two broken sons sitting across the table. Panic and despair had swallowed them whole. But for me, the performance was not over yet. Not even close. They still needed to learn the final lesson about the true value of what they had betrayed. Slowly, I placed the black leather briefcase back onto the table. The sharp click of the lock opening echoed through the room once again, drawing Brad's trembling eyes toward me. For a brief second, hope flickered across his face. He thought I was about to change my mind. He thought mercy was coming. But he was wrong. I pulled out the thick blue folder containing the documents for Garrison Lake Lodge. The folder from my serious drawer. Then I tossed it directly in front of him. Look at this. My voice remained calm, but every word carried the weight of concrete collapsing onto steel. Brad's hands shook as he opened the file page by page. His eyes widened the moment he saw photographs of the luxury lodge hidden deep inside the Wisconsin pine forest. Then his breathing stopped completely when he reached the final valuation page. $1.1 million. Slowly, I began to speak. Every sentence cut through the room like a sharpened blade. This is Garrison Lake Lodge. It is worth nearly 3 times more than the Kerr Lake house you were so desperate to sell. I secretly bought and built it back in 2016. My original plan was to leave it to both of you as your inheritance after I was gone. It was supposed to belong to my sons. The room felt like it had just been hit by an explosion. Brad and Tim froze completely. The contrast between the miserable $390,000 they had been fighting over and the $1.1 million they had just lost forever was too much for them to process. Brad's face turned pale as death. His lips trembled uncontrollably. Beside him, Tim broke down, sobbing, pounding his forehead against the table in unbearable regret. For a quick profit, they had destroyed the very foundation of their own future. Then I delivered the final blow, the knockout strike. I looked directly into their shattered faces and spoke one final truth. But that was yesterday's plan. The moment you called me on Sunday, I met with attorney Raymond Castillo. I signed every document transferring full ownership of Garrison Lake Lodge to a non-profit organization that supports underprivileged children. You will not receive a single dollar from my estate. The silence afterward was unbearable. Then I gave them the final sentence they would carry for the rest of their lives. Your greed erased you from the blueprint of my future. I picked up my briefcase and turned toward the door without hesitation. Behind me came the sound of choking sobs and the complete collapse of 2 men who had just lost everything. But even then, the worst consequence for Brad had not arrived yet, and the true peace waiting for the old engineer still lay ahead. In the days following that disastrous closing meeting, my sons' lives spiraled into a collapse they could no longer stop. Brad soon found himself drowning in serious legal trouble. Mr. and Mrs. Marsh officially filed a lawsuit against him for fraud and the illegal attempt to sell property that was never his to control. And the woman he sacrificed everything for. The wife who loved luxury designer labels and expensive appearances, she wasted no time. The moment she realized Brad was buried in debt, she filed for divorce and walked away with what little money he had left. Tim suffered differently. He drowned in guilt. Day after day, he sent messages begging for forgiveness. Long apologies, broken promises, desperate pleas. But it was too late. Once the foundation of trust collapses, it can never truly be rebuilt. As for me, I moved into Garrison Lake Lodge. The peace there felt almost unreal. That evening, I sat on the wooden porch of the lodge, hidden deep within the Wisconsin pine forest. A glass of red wine rested in my hand while the sunset slowly melted across the still surface of the lake. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Beside me sat a framed photograph of Renee. I smiled softly at her picture and realized something important. I had protected the honor of this family. My story became proof of one simple truth about life. Greed is like defective material in construction. It may help you build beautiful illusions for a little while, but eventually it will bring the entire structure crashing down. Respect. Family. The love between parent and child. Those things can never be purchased with money. And the price of greed and betrayal will always be far greater than anyone imagines. If you fail to value the foundation of your family one day, you will pay for it with your future. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what lesson you took away from it. I'll see you again in the next story. I lifted my glass and took one final sip of wine while the cool lake breeze drifted through the pine trees around me. The old engineer had finally completed the last blueprint of his life. A blueprint with no room left for betrayal, only peace, only justice. My future son-in-law, Julian, was casually insulting my daughter Chloe right there in my car. He sneered into the phone with his friend. He called Chloe annoying. He said comforting her was just a mandatory procedure before the wedding. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember this: the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose otherwise. Leave a number 1 in the comments so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to love this one. The story began with the screeching sound of tires sliding across the damp road. Through the rearview mirror, I saw Julian's face. He was leaning back in the rear seat, his eyes fixed on his phone screen, a smug smile spread across his face. He had no idea that the rideshare driver taking him to his destination was actually his future father-in-law. To Julian, I was just an invisible man. An elderly driver, quiet, always wearing a mask that covered most of his face, and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He casually insulted my daughter, his fiancée, treating her like a commodity. I heard every single word clearly, and I would remember them for a very long time because those words were like knives stabbing straight into the heart of a father. The daughter I cherished, like a priceless treasure, was in his eyes. Nothing more than a target with a price tag attached. My blood felt as though it were boiling. I had to use every bit of composure I had left to stop myself from turning the car around and punching that fake face of his. I took a deep breath and forced myself to remain silent. I needed to stay clear-headed. My anger at that moment would ruin everything. The car continued moving forward through the suffocating silence. Julian kept talking endlessly about his plans to manipulate Chloe after they were married. He had calculated every step to strip my daughter of her freedom. The deception was obvious in every cold word that came out of his mouth. I looked at myself again in the rearview mirror. The expression in my eyes was no longer one of shock. It had become the determination of a father willing to do whatever it took to protect his child. This battle was only beginning. Julian thought he was smart, but he had no idea that this rearview mirror was capturing every part of his true nature. Julian ended the call. Silence once again settled over the cramped interior of the car. I watched him through the still rearview mirror. Julian adjusted the collar of his neatly pressed shirt. He ran a hand through his hair, restoring his usual polished appearance. He paid absolutely no attention to the driver sitting in front of him. Becoming invisible in Julian's eyes was actually very easy. All I needed was a black medical mask, a pair of sunglasses that concealed my eyes, and a baseball cap pulled low over my forehead. But the biggest reason he failed to recognize me was his arrogance. To a young and successful chief financial officer like Julian, people who worked with their hands were nothing more than part of the scenery. He looked, but he never truly saw. He climbed into the car, gave his destination, and immediately disappeared into his own world of privilege. I still remember the very first day I accepted his ride 3 weeks earlier. When the app displayed the passenger's name as Julian and the pickup location as a luxury apartment complex in the suburbs, my heart skipped a beat. He was the fiancé Chloe always spoke about with such pride. The moment he opened the door and stepped into the back seat, I held my breath. I was afraid he would recognize me. I was afraid my presence would somehow damage my daughter's relationship. But Julian merely glanced at his phone screen and casually told me to get moving. My initial relief quickly turned into a bitter realization. The man who was about to marry my daughter was a completely different person when she wasn't around. For the past 3 weeks, I had quietly become the keeper of evidence, documenting Julian's double life. While Chloe looked at him with admiration and love, I sat here witnessing his cold conversations, selfish calculations, and carefully hidden contempt. Every ride was a new chapter in the book of lies he was writing. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. A feeling of helplessness and pain rose inside me. Was I protecting my daughter through this cowardly silence? Or was I becoming an accomplice to a deceiver? The car stopped at another red light. Julian sighed impatiently. He pulled out his phone again and dialed a new number. I stared into the rearview mirror, holding my breath as I waited. Julian's voice filled the car once more, this time lower, more secretive, carrying a revelation that could shatter the entire future Chloe was dreaming of. Julian ended the call. Silence once again settled over the cramped interior of the car. I watched him through the still rearview mirror. Julian adjusted the collar of his neatly pressed shirt. He ran a hand through his hair, restoring his usual polished appearance. He paid absolutely no attention to the driver sitting in front of him. Becoming invisible in Julian's eyes was actually very easy. All I needed was a black medical mask, a pair of sunglasses that concealed my eyes, and a baseball cap pulled low over my forehead. But the biggest reason he failed to recognize me was his arrogance. To a young and successful chief financial officer like Julian, people who worked with their hands were nothing more than part of the scenery. He looked, but he never truly saw. He climbed into the car, gave his destination, and immediately disappeared into his own world of privilege. I still remember the very first day I accepted his ride 3 weeks earlier. When the app displayed the passenger's name as Julian and the pickup location as a luxury apartment complex in the suburbs, my heart skipped a beat. He was the fiancé Chloe always spoke about with such pride. The moment he opened the door and stepped into the back seat, I held my breath. I was afraid he would recognize me. I was afraid my presence would somehow damage my daughter's relationship, but Julian merely glanced at his phone screen and casually told me to get moving. My initial relief quickly turned into a bitter realization. The man who was about to marry my daughter was a completely different person when she wasn't around. For the past 3 weeks, I had quietly become the keeper of evidence, documenting Julian's double life. While Chloe looked at him with admiration and love, I sat here witnessing his cold conversations, selfish calculations, and carefully hidden contempt. Every ride was a new chapter in the book of lies he was writing. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. A feeling of helplessness and pain rose inside me. Was I protecting my daughter through this cowardly silence? Or was I becoming an accomplice to a deceiver? The car stopped at another red light. Julian sighed impatiently. He pulled out his phone again and dialed a new number. I stared into the rearview mirror, holding my breath as I waited. Julian's voice filled the car once more, this time lower, more secretive, carrying a revelation that could shatter the entire future Chloe was dreaming of. The personnel appointment decision in Phoenix, Arizona. My hands began to tremble. I nearly pressed the accelerator by mistake. Julian had started a new call. His voice sounded excited, but it was filled with calculated malice. He confirmed to the person on the other end that he had accepted the position of director at a new branch in Arizona. It was more than 1,800 miles away from our home, away from Columbus. My mind spun. Just last night, during our family dinner, Chloe had happily talked about how the two of them were looking to buy a small house only 3 blocks from mine. My daughter completely trusted that they would stay here close to family. She had no idea she was about to be uprooted and thrown into a strange land far from everything she knew. I bit my lip until I tasted blood to stop myself from shouting. Julian kept talking endlessly about his plans. He spoke about the move as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He did not need to discuss it with Chloe. He only needed to inform her once everything had already been decided. The deception had reached its peak. He was isolating my daughter. He wanted to sever every connection between her and the people who loved her. Alone in an unfamiliar place, she would be completely vulnerable and forced to depend on him. The anger inside me churned like a storm. I stared at the road ahead, but my thoughts were in chaos. My poor daughter was still drowning in a manufactured happiness. She was carefully planning her wedding while this man was secretly building a strategy to remove her family from her life. The contrast was cruel. It squeezed the heart of a father until it hurt. Julian leaned his head back against the seat. Then he said something to his best friend over the phone. The words made my blood run cold. The farther she is from her family, the easier everything becomes. I looked into the rearview mirror again. Julian was smiling. It was the satisfied smile of a man who believed he had already won the game. A chill settled deep inside me. I knew I could not remain silent any longer. Tonight would be our family dinner. I had to find a way to warn Chloe before it was too late, but I could never have imagined that my daughter's blind love and Julian's cunning manipulation would turn my attempt to protect her into a complete disaster. The family dinner took place in the suffocating atmosphere of our small kitchen. The warm yellow light shone down on Chloe's radiant face and Julian's perfect smile. Watching them sit side by side made my chest tighten. I could see the deception lurking beneath the neatly pressed shirt of my future son-in-law. I tried to remain calm. I refilled Julian's glass and carefully began asking about his plans for the future. I mentioned that his company was expanding into other states. Then I casually asked whether he had ever considered relocating somewhere far away like Arizona. The atmosphere at the table instantly shifted. Julian froze for a brief second. A flash of surprise crossed his eyes, but he quickly regained his usual composure. With an awkward smile, he brushed the question aside and said that he always prioritized whatever was best for Chloe. But Chloe's reaction was the real knife to my heart. My daughter immediately put down her chopsticks. She looked at me with disappointment and anger in her eyes. Chloe defended Julian fiercely. She said I was always too suspicious. She accused me of deliberately searching for flaws where none existed in order to ruin her happiness. The bond between father and daughter cracked right there in our own home. Then Chloe said something that shattered my heart. She told me that I was always waiting for things to fall apart just so I could prove that I had been right all along. Pain and helplessness rose like a lump in my throat. I looked at my daughter, a good person who was being cruelly deceived. The frustration of a father who knew the truth but could not immediately present the evidence pushed my emotions to their breaking point. I had to remain silent to keep the situation from getting worse. Julian sat there calmly, taking a small sip of wine. The look he gave me was openly provocative. He knew he had won this round. He had successfully turned me into nothing more than a paranoid, selfish old man in the eyes of his fiancée. The dinner ended in cold silence. Chloe stood up with Julian and left without looking back at me even once. I remained alone in the darkness of the kitchen, listening as the sound of Julian's car faded into the distance. My anger hardened into an unshakable decision. Words alone were no longer enough. The next morning, Julian booked another ride with me. He climbed into the back seat with the same attitude, treating me as though I were invisible. Almost immediately, he called his attorney. I held my breath and adjusted the familiar rearview mirror to listen. The words that came out of his mouth next, concerning a secret contract, made me realize something horrifying. This man did not merely want to take my daughter far away from her family. He wanted to turn her into a prisoner with not a single dollar to her name. Julian's cold voice echoed from the back seat. He was on the phone with his private attorney. Once again, the rearview mirror became a witness to this man's cruelty. Julian began discussing a secret prenuptial agreement. Using dry legal terminology, he carefully calculated how to protect every part of his assets. But the most despicable part was that he was setting a trap designed to strip Chloe of her rights. He wanted her to sign unfavorable clauses without ever realizing what they meant. Helping others heal emotionally was my daughter's greatest passion. She had spent years studying to earn her position as a counselor. Yet over the phone, Julian openly declared that he would force Chloe to quit her job as soon as they were married. He said the work consumed too much time and offered no financial value to him. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles began to ache. The anger inside me churned until it felt like it was crushing my chest. Anyone could see that Julian was building an invisible cage around Chloe. He did not want a partner to share his life with. He wanted an obedient doll displayed behind glass. A woman with no career, no independent finances, and no meaningful connection to her family. That was how he planned to exert financial control and manipulate every aspect of my daughter's life. My inner thoughts shifted from fear and helplessness to unwavering determination. I could not stand by and watch my daughter walk willingly into that nightmare. The frustration I had suppressed for weeks had transformed into a burning resolve to act. I looked into the rearview mirror. There was no hesitation left in my eyes. Julian continued talking without pause, completely absorbed in what he believed was his flawless victory. He thought he was clever. He thought every piece on the board was exactly where he wanted it. But he had forgotten one thing. The invisible driver sitting in front of him was remembering every single word. I understood that the warnings I had tried to give Chloe at dinner the night before had been completely useless. Her blind faith in Julian required something stronger than my suspicions. I needed undeniable proof. I needed facts that could not be explained away. This deception had to be exposed at its source. The ride ended when Julian stepped out in front of a towering office building. He slammed the car door without a word of thanks and hurried off to join the flow of well-dressed professionals. I watched him disappear into the crowd, a cold feeling settling deep inside me. Then I pulled out my phone and called an old friend. It was time to enlist the help of someone who knew how to uncover the truth. What I did not expect was that the first warning from my old friend would send a chill down my spine and reveal just how dangerous the man my daughter intended to marry truly was. I arranged to meet Walter at a small diner tucked away on a quiet street corner. He was a former private investigator with 30 years of experience confronting the darker side of human nature. Walter looked over my rough notes, then lowered his reading glasses. He took a long breath, his voice calm, steady, and shaped by decades of experience. Walter spoke to me with complete seriousness. Men like Julian aren't criminals. They don't kill people or rob banks. They simply believe they're smarter than everyone else. Manipulators like him always leave traces in financial records and hidden schedules. Walter warned me to stop relying on suspicion alone. The anger of a father would cloud my judgment. What I needed was the truth. Only undeniable evidence could save Chloe. The advice from my old friend hit me like a bucket of cold water. It forced me to see things clearly. I could no longer continue playing the role of a passive driver. I began a quiet but dangerous search for the truth. Under Walter's guidance, I documented every time Julian entered my car. I recorded his calculating phone conversations through the rearview mirror. I collected drafts of prenuptial agreements that he accidentally left behind or discussed during rides. With each passing day, the phone in the pocket of this old driver filled with more evidence of Julian's selfishness and deception. The frustration inside me remained tightly controlled, transforming into the foundation of a carefully planned counterattack. If you've made it this far into the story, then perhaps you're enjoying it. Please do us a quick favor, like and subscribe. Leave a number 5 in the comments so I know you've watched this far, and tell me how you think the story will end to see whether your prediction is correct. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. I slipped the phone back into my shirt pocket. It felt as though I were carrying a ticking time bomb. Every piece of Julian's double life had now been exposed. He was scheduled to sign a lease agreement in Arizona the following week. He was also close to finalizing the financial trap he had prepared for my daughter. Everything was moving at a terrifying speed. That afternoon, the ride request notification sounded once again. The passenger was Julian. I pulled my cap lower and drove to pick him up as usual. What I never expected was that during this ride, Julian would suddenly start a conversation with me. The man who had always treated me as if I were invisible now wanted advice from an old driver. It was a cruel joke of fate, one that pushed the tension to an entirely new level. Julian climbed into the car. This time he did not immediately look at his phone. Instead, he let out a long, weary sigh. Through the rearview mirror, I saw him lift his head and stare directly at the back of my neck. The silence lingered for several seconds. For the first time in 3 weeks, Julian voluntarily spoke to this invisible driver. His tone carried the usual arrogance disguised beneath a thin layer of false humility. He asked whether I had a family, and whether older women made unreasonable demands the way younger women supposedly did. The irony of the situation made my heart skip a beat. The manipulator was seeking marriage advice from the very father he was trying to isolate from his daughter. I forced my anger deep into my chest. Deliberately lowering my voice and altering my manner of speaking so he would not recognize me, I answered with a simple piece of advice. Listen more than you talk. But Julian's arrogance ran too deep. He immediately dismissed my response. With a smug laugh, he launched into a lengthy speech about himself. He claimed that women did not know what they truly wanted until a successful man laid out a path for them. He proudly boasted that he had prepared a major surprise for his fiancée. Then, he began talking about tomorrow's extravagant engagement celebration at Brookside Country Club. That would be the moment, he said, when he would publicly announce all of his decisions in front of everyone. Once it was done before an audience, Chloe would have no way to refuse. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead. My hands tightened around the steering wheel until they felt numb. The irony and hidden tension inside that vehicle had reached a breaking point. Julian genuinely believed he was designing a perfect future. He convinced himself that his control and manipulation would be wrapped in such a romantic package that nobody would dare oppose it. What he did not know was that every word he spoke and every piece of evidence he left behind was already in my possession. The car eventually stopped in front of his office building. Julian stepped out, threw one final arrogant glance in my direction, and walked away without another word. I watched his retreating figure through the windshield. My eyes were colder and more determined than they had ever been. The patience I had maintained for an entire month was nearly exhausted. Tomorrow he planned to unveil his perfect future. Tomorrow I planned to show Chloe exactly who had designed it. The final confrontation would take place at Brookside Country Club before 100 guests. I had everything I needed. What I never anticipated, however, was that the moment I abandoned my anonymity and exposed Julian would also uncover another horrifying secret hidden within those documents. A secret far darker than anything I had discovered so far. The ballroom at Brookside Country Club shimmered beneath sparkling lights while soft piano music drifted through the air. 100 elegantly dressed guests mingled and exchanged congratulations. Julian stood on the stage in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Beside him stood Chloe. My daughter looked radiant in her pure white dress. She gazed at Julian with all the trust and love of a woman about to become a wife. The purity of my daughter only made the deception of the man beside her seem even more disgusting. Julian stepped up to the microphone. With confidence, he announced a surprise gift for his fiancée. He declared that the two of them would be moving to Arizona immediately after the wedding to begin a new life of luxury and success. Using polished romantic language, he transformed the act of isolating Chloe from her family into what sounded like a grand gesture of love. Chloe froze. The smile vanished from her face. Shock spread across her features. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Julian subtly tightened his arm around her waist, a silent reminder that she was expected to agree in front of 100 guests. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The frustration I had carried for weeks finally erupted. I stepped out from behind the ballroom doors. I was no longer dressed as a rideshare driver. I wore a tailored suit. I removed the black medical mask. I took off the sunglasses. Then I lifted my head and walked directly toward the stage. Whispers immediately spread throughout the room. "Dad," Chloe's voice trembled with shock. Julian saw me. For a brief moment, confusion flashed across his face. Then his familiar arrogance returned. He opened his mouth, preparing to greet his future father-in-law with polite charm. I never gave him the chance. I climbed onto the stage, pulled a thick folder from my jacket, and slammed it onto the signing table. The sharp crack echoed through the ballroom. Instantly, the room fell silent. The silence was so complete that it felt as though everyone could hear a single spoon hit the floor. I looked directly into Julian's eyes. Then I spoke loudly enough for every guest to hear. I exposed his entire scheme. I turned on the recorder I had carried in my pocket. Julian's cold, calculating voice filled the ballroom. "The farther she is from her family, the easier everything becomes." The words echoed through the stunned crowd. Then came the discussions about the secret prenuptial agreement, the clauses that would force Chloe to leave her career, the plans that would leave her financially dependent, the strategy designed to turn her into a prisoner with no assets and no independence. The color drained from Julian's face. His confidence vanished. His arrogance shattered. For the first time since I had known him, he looked afraid. Suddenly, he lunged toward me, attempting to grab the recorder. But Walter was already moving. My old friend stepped between us and blocked him. The mask had finally been ripped away. Before 100 witnesses, the respected financial executive stood exposed as a manipulative fraud. Whispers of shock swept through the crowd. Expressions of disgust appeared everywhere I looked. The carefully crafted image Julian had spent years building collapsed in a matter of minutes, and the satisfaction of seeing the truth revealed was overwhelming. Chloe stared at Julian as if she were looking at a complete stranger. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Then she turned toward me. In that moment she understood. Every warning, every concern, every uncomfortable question I had asked, they had all been true. Yet amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. Julian suddenly began to laugh. Not nervously, not awkwardly. He laughed wildly. The sound echoed across the silent ballroom. Then he fixed me with a look filled with hatred. His eyes moved toward the folder, lying on the table. And with a voice trembling between rage and triumph, he shouted one final sentence. A sentence that revealed a secret hidden within those documents. A secret that even I had not yet discovered because I had never finished reading every page. And the moment those words left his mouth, the entire room went silent once again. Julian shouted in desperation. He claimed that without him, my family's company would collapse into bankruptcy. He believed money could conceal every rotten part of his character. But he was wrong. Chloe stepped forward. She was no longer crying. The only things left in her eyes were cold determination and clarity. Slowly, she removed her diamond engagement ring. Then she threw it directly at Julian. In a firm voice, Chloe declared that he had never respected her. He had only ever loved himself. The crowd erupted into applause. Humiliated, Julian lowered his head and walked out of the ballroom beneath a storm of disapproving stares. His double life had finally come to an end. 6 months passed quickly. Our lives gradually returned to a peaceful routine. Chloe never moved to Arizona. She remained in Columbus and expanded her own counseling practice. My daughter regained both her independence and the radiant smile she once had. Seeing her happy again brought me a sense of relief I could hardly describe. I often sat in my living room looking out the window and reflecting on everything that had happened. As a father, I learned an important lesson. Protecting your children does not mean solving every problem for them or making every decision on their behalf. Protecting them means helping them see the truth even when that truth is painful. Once the true nature of a liar is exposed, you must allow them to make their own choice. My daughter grew stronger through that painful experience. Thank you for staying with Dad's Real Life Revenge until the end of this story. Join our community by liking and subscribing to enjoy more compelling stories centered around family loyalty and justice. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. The rearview mirror in my car is still there. It is no longer a witness to deception. Now it reflects only my peaceful smile and my daughter's freedom. The truth may arrive late, but justice and the love of family will always be the strongest fortress of all.